Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. I am super excited for this week's video, which will be a slightly different sort of content as I am frantically preparing material for this year's costume symposium. We hope to see you all there, as well as fulfilling a large surprise order of gaiters, so that is where the majority of my time is being spent these days. But I'm actually really in love with the object of this week's video, which is sitting right here before me. This is the result of an incredibly lucky estate sale purchase, and I wasn't sure exactly what I had when I bought it, but I thought it was really lovely with some gorgeous, intricate details, and I was intrigued by what its original purpose could be, so I bought it, and a bit of research into its past proved incredibly interesting. It turns out that this is a brass sewing bird. They were a form of sewing clamp developed in America in the early 1850s, as you can see by looking at the patent date stamped on the wing. These types of clamps, often called a third hand, helped hold large lengths of fabric during sewing, especially the hemming process, and they work by clamping the bird to the edge of the table and then using the bird's beak to hold the fabric taut. Those of you who do a fair amount of hand sewing are probably familiar with the technique of pinning your work to something, whether that's a tailor's ham, or often in my case it's the fabric of my pants, in order to create a bit of tension which makes it faster and easier to stitch. It's much easier to sew fabric when it's taut than when it's sort of flip-flopping all over the place. And the invention of the sewing bird made it super convenient to easily readjust your fabric as you sew. You simply had to open the bird's mouth by pressing the top and bottom tail together and slide the fabric to a new position. So I thought we could take a brief look at the history and origins of this charming sewing accessory while I do a little light restoration to this tool to get it back in tip-top shape, because while it might be an antique, I do plan on using it for its intended purpose. This little bird also needs a name, so give me a hand and throw some suggestions in the comments below, because I haven't settled on anything I love. If it helps the juices flow, the last time I named a bird, I called him Mr. Atticus. The first step in this restoration is going to be a gentle cleanup of the brass. I could use something a bit more abrasive and polish it to within an inch of its little metal life, but the patina is honestly part of the charm of this little bird, so instead I'll simply be using some mild dishwashing soap, some tepid water, and some very soft cleaning tools. The concept of a sewing clamp itself was not new in the 1850s. These tools had been around in Europe during the late 17th and 18th centuries, but it seems like the form of a bird became quite popular in the 1850s, with 4 different patents being lodged in 1853 alone. The first by Charles Waterman, followed shortly by several others. This bird appears to be one of Waterman's birds, as the date on the wing matches the date on his patent. Waterman was the first to patent the bird, although he had already been selling the sewing clamps, or grippers, before being granted the patent, and his version became the most popular, being known as the Waterman bird. All of the modern day articles I read on the topic referenced a specific ad which shows 2 women on opposite sides of a table sewing and illustrates the difference that the bird can make in the seamstress's posture. These articles all cite the ad as appearing in the Hartford Times on June 5th of 1852, although this seems to be a case of an online echo chamber since I found the Hartford Times from June 5th of that year. Not an easy task in and of itself, and there was no such ad anywhere to be found. So folks, don't believe everything you read online, even if it seems to be cited across multiple sources. It took me a few more hours, but I did finally dig up an example of the ad, this one specifically appearing in July of 1852. As described, the woman without a sewing bird is hunched over her stitchery, her unhealthy position clearly belying her shared ancestry with the floor troll, while the woman with a sewing bird is sitting upright, showing the clamp's health-preserving properties. And I must admit, this might be one of the few times that there is actually something to the claims made in the advertising. Those of you who joined me last week for a look at some of the more ridiculous notions found in late Victorian magazines and newspapers will probably believe me when I say that, not unlike today, advertising claims may exceed the realistic lived experience of the items they're promoting. But in this case, I did find that using the sewing bird to clamp my material allowed me to have a better posture while sewing. This was certainly no guarantee of good posture, but it did allow me the freedom to choose what position I wanted to sew in. So now that we've spruced up the brass, let's spend the rest of this video getting the fabric bits up to snuff on this lovely bird while we learn a bit about the more romantic side of these tools. Most of the existing birds I found online have a place for a pincushion in the front and a spot for an emery ball on its back. And if you think this one is in rough shape, you should see the state of some of the clamps online. This bird still has both of its little metal platforms. The pincushion is still intact, albeit incredibly threadbare, and the emery ball is a bit misshapen, but still there. Most of the photos I was able to find of these birds show the cushions being covered in some sort of velvet. And indeed, we can see that here, under the bird's breast, where the original fabric is the most protected, it does seem to have been velvet. So let's take a bit of velvet that I've got conveniently laying around and try to carefully cover the existing pincushion. Through the years, as the tool became more popular, the designs for the sewing birds changed and became ever more decorated, varied, and elaborate, sometimes taking the form of a wide variety of animals and cherubs. Additional features were sometimes added, such as winding reels for yarn or thread, rug braiders, thread cutters, scissor sharpeners, or other features to help with sewing-related tasks. As designs became more elaborate, the sewing bird changed from being a purely practical sewing aid to a more personal and sometimes even romantic item for a seamstress. Supposedly, for some well-to-do woman, a highly decorated and elaborate sewing bird began to be considered a status symbol. A fancy bird being an indication that the person had enough disposable income to afford and splurge on purchasing an expensive version of an ordinary sewing tool. For others, the sewing bird represented a romantic token. It was apparently not uncommon for a young man to give a sewing bird to his intended bride some months before the wedding, when she was occupied with numerous sewing projects in preparation for the wedding and her married life. The idea was that as she sewed using the bird, the future bride would be reminded of her fiancé, a notion that I can see occasionally backfiring. Now that the pincushion is back in working order, I'd like to tackle the emery ball as well. And because it's looking a bit sad and deflated, I think I'm going to add a tiny bit of padding to fill it out before covering it too with some velvet. The sewing bird was popular enough that it was even a character in a children's book. In the 19-teens, Jane Eyre Fryer wrote a series of books that were designed to teach young women basic domestic skills. The sewing book, Adventures Among Thimble People, Easy Steps in Sewing for Big and Little Girls, was published in 1913. And in the book, a little girl by the name of Mary Frances is taught to sew by the sewing bird and the fairy lady. The Waterman bird was produced into the 20th century. After the invention of the sewing machine, the need for sewing birds understandably diminished, but they were still manufactured as novelty items. A modern reproduction was manufactured in the 1950s, and the Singer Sewing Machine Company produced a few as late as 1980. These reproductions differ slightly from the original models, mainly in that they do not have the patent markings on the wing, and that the materials and craftsmanship used is slightly inferior when compared to the original products. So there we have it. These relatively inexpensive sewing accessories from the past are antique collectibles today. The little sewing bird can be remembered as a practical tool or a romantic token of affection from another time. But either way, this little guy, who is looking quite chipper after his glam up, is going to have a special place in my sewing toolbox. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I upload every other Friday. If you would like to support my channel in a more direct way, I have a Ko-fi account linked below, so you can go toss a coin to your stitcher. And don't forget that this little dude is still nameless, so unleash your creativity in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.